Coming up on Booked on Rock, we go through the discography of one of the most underrated bands to come out of the 80s, Night Ranger. You Can Still Rock in America, Sister Christian, Sentimental Street, Don't Tell Me You Love Me, so many more. We'll get into it with author Tim Durling, who's just written a brand new book all about Night Ranger. That's next.
We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock. I'm Eric Senich. It is great to have Tim Durling back on the show. His latest book is Sing Me Away, the Night Ranger album review. Tim, welcome back.
Thanks, Eric.
Love your story when you became a fan of the band. This is one of those childhood moments that every music fan has. Take us back to that moment on the playground, summer 1984.
Yeah, I mean, everybody's got an entry point, right? Everybody's got a point where they remember hearing a song for the first time, and after that, they can't imagine a world without that song. I'd love to be able to say I was in on the ground floor and was watching MTV and saw the video for Don't Tell Me You Love Me, but unfortunately, I'm up here in Canada. We didn't have MTV, and so I first heard of Night Ranger when probably most of the world did, which is Sister Christian. But I distinctly remember being at a playground, and it was summer, summer 80, must have been summer 84. And there were some older kids and they had a boombox, like you do. And probably, I don't know if they were playing a cassette or if they were just playing the radio, but I heard this song, Motor In, and I'm like, I didn't know what they were saying. I just knew I liked it. And I liked it a lot. And that was it. That was the first time I heard the song. It took me a while before I put together who it was, what it was actually called. I just knew I liked it.
This band has sold 17 million albums total. Pretty impressive. Their first 5 albums sold more than 10 million. Sister Christian, number 5 single. Several other top 40 hit singles in the 1980s. Don't Tell Me You Love Me, When You Close Your Eyes, Sentimental Street, 4 in the Morning, I Can't Take Any More, and Goodbye. So we'll get to all of those in this episode. Let's start with the debut album, Dawn Patrol, released November of 1982. The lineup, Jack Blades on bass, lead vocals, Brad Gillis, lead guitar, Jeff Watson on guitars, Alan Fitzgerald on keyboards, and Kelly Keagy on drums and lead vocals. Don't Tell Me You Love Me, Sing Me Away, Young Girl in Love are the singles. You note in the book how accomplished this album sounds for a debut. Pretty impressive. How long had the band been together at that point?
I think the band had been together for maybe a little less than 2 years, but they were all music biz veterans at this point. Alan Fitzgerald had the probably longest recording career at that point because he replaced Bill Church on the second Montrose album. So he goes all the way back with Sammy Hagar in 1974 on the Paper Money album. So he plays bass and keyboards. A few years after that, he actually joined Sammy's solo band with Bill Church. It's the only example I can think of where somebody ended up in a band with a guy that they replaced in another band. So Bill was on bass and Fitz was on keyboards. And then, he went back to Ronnie Montrose for a while, and he was actually the keyboard player on one of the Gamma albums.
Gamma.
So
yeah, that's Ronnie's band.
That was Ronnie's band, late 80s or late 70s, early 80s. They did 3 albums in and around that time. Jack Blades and Brad Gillis were in a band called Rubicon, which was formed by Jerry Martini, who had been in Sly and the Family Stone. And it's very, very different. It's very different than Night Ranger. So don't make the mistake that I made and think, well, this has to sound like Night Ranger if it's got Jack Blades and Brad Gillis in it. Not at all.
Really?
Yeah, and if it's much more Sly and the Family Stone than it is Night Ranger. Jack plays some incredible slap bass on that. You would never know. I mean, it's a total. Given the background, it's sometimes I wonder, how did Dawn Patrol come out of? Where did that come from? And the hard rock stuff, unless it was just the fact that they just liked, music. But then at one point, even Kelly Keagy was in Rubicon. I think Rubicon only did 2 albums. Kelly was not any of the albums. And then the 3 of them were sort of a core, and they formed a band called Stereo, which was more of a new wave thing. No recordings have ever been released to my knowledge. And eventually that morphed into, some of the songs were the same, but it morphed into more of a hard rock thing. And then we know, of course, Brad Gillis got the gig with Ozzy after Randy Rhoads died, and he did the tour and ended up on the Speak of the Devil album, which is all Black Sabbath covers. So he has that cred, and that's one of the reasons why Night Ranger, even though they're a lighter band, they have a lot of cred in the metal world because of Brad's time with Ozzy. It's almost like if you've been anointed by Ozzy, people think of you as one of his guitar players forever and a day. Because look at Jakey Lee, he played on 2 albums, and people always bring him up. Yeah, he played with Ozzy, but Night Ranger was their thing, and he passed up a permanent gig with Ozzy because he believed in what his band was doing. So, and I think we're better for it.
That's the story. Yeah, that he could have joined Ozzy, said,
Yep.
nope, no thanks. So that's the question is, if he did join Ozzy, does Night Ranger go forward?
I don't know because I mean they had Jeff Watson on guitar, but they really wanted the 2 guitar players at this point. And if you think about it, I can't think of another band that is. I know there's a better word, Eric. I can't think of a better word than configuration, but I know there's a better word for the setup of Night Ranger. It's a unique lineup because you've got Jack Blades on bass and vocals, Kelly Kagi on drums and vocals. So your lead singers are your rhythm section. You've got 2 amazing guitar players, and then you got a keyboard player. So it's a unique setup. It's not your typical 5-piece rock band where you got a front man, 2 guitar players, maybe a guitar player, keyboard player, bass player. It's really different. Everybody's got an instrument. Everybody's got their part to play in this band, and that's 3/5 of the band are intact, but that's still the lineup they go by today. And they weren't kids at this point, but they were all pushing 30. Not that that's old, but they had that experience under their belts. So I think that's one of the reasons why, some debut albums you like them because there's a certain naivete about them or a quaintness, and there's hints of greatness to come. But some bands just come out firing, Van Halen and Boston and Foreigner. And I would put Night Ranger in that category. There's no growing pains here. That first album is fully realized and just amazingly good and amazingly consistent.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
When? Oh, patience, my dear, patience. Remember, absence makes the heart grow fonder.
Who are the main songwriters for Night Ranger?
Jack Blades is definitely the main songwriter. He has solo writing credit on a lot of the songs if you look through their writing credits. I mean, Brad Gillis co-writes, Jeff Watson would co-write, Kelly would, famously, Kelly wrote Sister Christian. Alan Fitzgerald is like the unsung hero because his contributions, I think, go further than some of the songs that he's credited for. Sister Christian being a good example. He wrote that piano part at the beginning. Pretty iconic, right? Can you imagine the song without it? So they were all accomplished songwriters, but Jack is the main one, and I think he's also the main lyricist. And I like his lyrical style because he tells stories. His lyrics are sort of self-contained stories, a lot of them are, and they're very evocative. It's easy to see why he became an in-demand songwriter in the 90s.
Yeah, that debut album set him up nicely for the follow-up. They had the attention of radio. They had the attention of MTV. The result, the band's best-selling album, Midnight Madness. October of '83 it came out. Over 1 million copies sold, 3 singles. You Can Still Rock in America, Sister Christian, and When You Close Your Eyes. All 3 still get played on classic rock radio. And you say in the book, the front and back covers make for a fun Where's Waldo experience.
Yeah, there's tons of characters you can spot there. There's vampires and magicians and cheerleaders and astronauts, and it's one of those things you really got to get the vinyl to figure out everything that's there. There's a lot of things going on. Somebody's like climbing up the wall. I think that album cover shoot was done in the Universal Studios lot. The other thing though about Night Ranger is that they were very fortunate. They had a major hiccup with Dawn Patrol because their record label, Boardwalk Records, went under. Boardwalk Records was formed by Neil Bogart, who had formerly been with Casablanca Records. So Kiss fans will know the name Neil Bogart. He died in 1982, and the label kind of folded with him. And really, there were a handful of artists on Boardwalk, and the only ones that went on to any success were Night Ranger and Joan Jett and the Blackhearts. But fortunately, there was difficulty with getting the record Dawn Patrol in stores because Don't Tell Me You Love Me was taking off on radio, and the video was getting a lot of play on MTV because, again, this is At this point, we're sort of into early 1983. MTV had been on the air for less than 2 years. They still don't have a huge backlog of videos to play. So when a new video came out, I'm told by a lot of people older than me that grew up in the States watching MTV, that video was on. It almost seemed every hour we saw the video to Don't Tell Me You Love Me. So even though the song was popular, it was hard to get the album stocked in stores. Fortunately, MCA picked up their deal, reissued Dawn Patrol, and that was their label for the rest of the 80s. Now, they didn't do everything right as a label, but what record label does? But that was one good thing because most bands, you put your first album out and your first album, your record label implodes. That's pretty much it. The only other band I can think of that recovered from that was Twisted Sister, oddly enough, right around the same time because their first album came out in 82 and their label tanked and then Atlantic picked them up. So yeah, Midnight Madness was I think some of the songs they were working on before Dawn Patrol. I've been told that Sister Christian was actually written for, in the sessions that produced the Dawn Patrol album, but it was saved for the second album. And obviously that's a career song for them, right? That's the song that gave them a name. It actually went all the way to #1 up here in Canada. Night Ranger were never a band that toured Canada all that much, but for that particular time, the Midnight Madness album went gold, and they did have a #1 song. But yeah, that was their calling card song to this day. It's a unique situation where you have a band where the success of one song sort of outsizes the success of the entire band. In other words, there's a lot more people that know Sister Christian than would know, say, the individual players in Night Ranger and maybe even who does the song.
Sure.
It's a little bit like, you could say Mr. Big is like that, Extreme is like that. It's not like Journey where you have a dozen or so radio staples that you could never label them one-hit wonder. It's like, well, which one are you talking about? Even though Night Ranger had 6 top 40 singles, Sister Christian, it's unique. It's got a unique title. It's got a unique hook. Everything about it it's not a cookie cutter power ballad by any stretch of the imagination. And it's remained in the public eye. And it's a song that will outlive all of us. Now, I happen to think that Night Ranger had in their arsenal of songs as many radio staples as Journey or Foreigner. I think that they did all right. I think they should have done better. I just think that they had the capability and not the capability. They did deliver songs that should have been radio staples and that we should all be sick of hearing. But for whatever reason, it didn't exactly happen that way. They sold a lot of albums, but it's always easy to blame record labels because they're an easy target, but MCA weren't exactly a hard rock label. Now, maybe they had a little bit more savvy than, say, A&M. I always pick on them when I talk about Y&T not becoming superstars, but I know for a time, Night Ranger were MTV darlings. So there was probably a period between like 83 and 86 where they played Night Ranger a ton. That helped, they did well on the road. They became a headline act during that time, but they never stayed there long enough to the point where they can go out now and headline big places. They can go out now and headline large size theaters, places like that. They can do very, very well as special guests on a bigger tour and, in often cases blow the headliners off the stage. But yeah, I mean, they're just one of those bands that I've always been a huge fan of. And to my knowledge, there's never been a book on them.
It is a head scratcher. I mean, we're talking, again, how many albums?
13 studio albums. Yeah. And they kind of, like a lot of bands, they had some growing pains adjusting to the 90s. A lot of 80s bands did. But once they signed with Frontiers Records, because Frontiers Records, it's an Italian label, they become home to a lot of classic bands and a lot of newer bands that have a classic sound. Now, unfortunately, you get on a label like that and it's a ceiling. There's a ceiling, right? Like your reach is limited. And sometimes those albums don't always stay in print. Like I've never seen a Frontiers Records album in a store. I've always had to, order them online, which is fine. But in 2011, I'm going to mention this a lot because it's a pivotal moment in their career, I think. They came out with an album called Somewhere in California. That was like a renaissance. That began like a Night Ranger renaissance, and they've since released 3 more albums. So between 2011 and 2021, they put out 4 studio albums. They're all really, really good. And sadly, they just don't get the recognition. But
I'll be honest, I didn't even know they were released.
Again, that's why I did this book. And you're someone that knows about music, right? So you imagine the average radio listener, you're never going to hear about this stuff ever. So, Night Ranger could have been a band that lived and died in the 80s because they put out 5 albums on MC, well, 5 if you count Dawn Patrol, but 5 albums in the 80s. And by the time that they put out their 5th album, which is actually probably my favorite album, Man in Motion, in 1988, MCA was not promoting them. MCA was not promoting a lot of veteran bands at this point. They had moved on to pop and R&B. It was all about Bobby Brown and Tiffany and acts like that. But your rock bands are your bread and butter. But I digress. So Night Ranger, not because of any real internal conflict, more just frustration with the music business, disbanded in sometime in 1989. And that could have been the end, but they eventually did get back together after sort of a lot of classic bands. If you look through their career, have one album that for one reason or another is kind of an outlier. If you think about Aerosmith, they've got Rockin' a Hard Place. Kiss has music from The Elder. Van Halen's got Van Halen 3. There's tons of other examples, I'm sure, but most bands have one album where, Metallica's got Saint Anger, where people go, well, I don't know about that one. I don't know about that one. Well, Night Ranger's version of that is an album that came out in 1995 called Feeding Off the Mojo. Now, this was the first Night Ranger album in 7 years, but the notable thing about this album is that Jack Blades is nowhere to be found. Jack Blades, of course, had a very successful second act as a member of Damn Yankees, and I think he proved a lot of naysayers wrong. That first album is double platinum. High Enough went all the way to number 3, and he reinvented himself. And they did 2 albums, 90 and 92. First one was more successful. The second one did go gold, and it went gold and had a top 20 single called Where You Going Now in the heart of grunge. So they were doing okay. But Jack Blades was doing that. Then he and Tommy Shaw formed an acoustic duo, Shaw Blades. While that was going on, Kelly Keagy and Brad Gillis still had, obviously, the rights to use the Night Ranger name. So they sort of reformed, and they reformed with a guy named Gary Moon on bass and vocals. Gary had been kicking around the scene for quite a long time. One of his gigs that would be recognizable to sort of melodic rock listeners was he was a member of Jeff Paris's band. Jeff Paris is mostly known as a songwriter. You've probably seen his name on a few songs.
Yeah.
Vixen, Mr. Big, Y&T. He's on one of his albums, as is Matt Sorum, actually. It's a rabbit hole. But they demoed a bunch of songs and they started playing around, obviously playing very small places. They put this album out called Feeding Off the Mojo in 1995. And opinions are divided on this album. Some don't consider it a Night Ranger album because Jack Blades isn't there. I think it's quite a good album. And when Kelly Keagy takes lead vocals, it sounds like Night Ranger. Gary Moon doesn't sound at all like Jack Blades. Gary Moon's got more of a Tom Kiefer voice. It's very raspy. Sometimes a little Kip Winger, sometimes a little Mark Slaughter, but very much of the early 90s period. It's a little bit different musically, and the closest comparison I can make is the 94 Motley Crue album, which I really like that album because it's different.
The
But a lot of
self-titled
people-
one.
Yeah, with John Corabi on
Yeah.
vocals. A lot of people said no Vince, no Motley.
Right.
It's kind of the same idea, although, like I said, you do have one of the main singers still on this album. But the band themselves, the original 5-piece lineup of Night Ranger, reunited in 96, and they did 2 albums, and then things got complicated. But they themselves don't even consider Feeding Off the Mojo part of their catalog, because in 1998, they released an album called Seven. Well, actually, that's their 8th album, but that just shows you that Feeding Off the Mojo album it's like the album that dare not speak its name, which, of course, when you're somebody like me, you're like, why? I want to know more. It's like before I got into Kiss, I knew about this album called The Elder that nobody liked to talk about and the band didn't like to talk about. That just made me want to listen to it all the more.
Those are the most interesting parts of the career.
Well, I'm sure you know who I mean by Chuck Klosterman. He's a well-known writer. And I saw an interview with Chuck talking about it's so true. If you like a band, you're interested in the high points of their career. But if you love a band, you want to know about the low points. where the wheels were coming off. You just want to know about everything. And that's really true because there is something very interesting because you look at it, not that you're, oh yeah, I want to know the dirt. I want to know what they went through and what they had to do to come out of it, you know. But like I said, the original five-piece lineup did come back together. Now, Alan Fitzgerald was the first of the original guys to permanently leave.
Alan Fitzgerald was the one that was some kind of a falling out where he posted something on social media.
I think that's Jeff Watson.
That's Jeff Watson.
I've never,
Okay.
Alan or Fitz, as most people call him, he's been very quiet. He's like the mystery guy. The only thing I know for sure is that in between, before Night Ranger reconvened, he was Eddie Van Halen's keyboard tech. He was with Eddie for a long, long time, which is, of course, at that time would have been, he and Sammy go that far back. And I'm not sure how he ended up with that gig, but it might have been, do you know anybody that can tech keyboards? And Sammy's like, find out what Fitzgerald is doing. But he was with him all the way up until even on the Tokyo Dome album from 2015, he's credited on that album. And at one point, he had something to do with Springsteen. So
Really?
I'm sure, yeah. I'm not a Springsteen aficionado, but I at one point he was doing these acoustic shows with just him and like a piano
Yeah.
player or something.
Yeah.
Fitz was that piano player. Springsteen paycheck has got to be more than a Night Ranger paycheck. Let's be real. And also, I think Fitz was older than the rest of the guys. With Jeff Watson, who's the blonde guitar player, there was a bad falling out and it got personal. And I remember on melodicrock.com, I used to follow that website a lot.
Remember it well.
Andrew McNeese's site out of Australia. He posted this long open letter, and it was you don't like to read the dirty laundry in public, but when you see it, you kind of can't help it. It's like passing by an accident. You kind of have to look.
And it was posted by who? Jeff Watson?
Jeff, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, the band posted a rebuttal, but it was very much short and to the point, but Jeff went into
all I've seen
detail.
is the rebuttal on Wikipedia. There's nothing about what Jeff said.
Yeah, that may have been something that's, you have to go to the dark web to find it now, but I do remember reading it at the time.
I mean, what was the gist of it, or is it something that's not worth repeating?
I think it had something to do with, well, the easy answer is probably money, but I think it had to do with who actually owns the name Night Ranger. I think it had a lot to do with that, like, what percentage of the name does he own? And that culminated the point where Jeff was no longer with the band. It was a long, long period in between albums. So they put the album 7 out in 1998. And it was 9 years before there was another Night Ranger album. And it finally surfaced in Japan and other parts of the world in 2007. It didn't get a US release until 2008. And it was called Hole in the Sun. And it is far and away my least favorite Night Ranger album. When I hear it, I hear conflict and I hear anger. And that's not what I want. That's not what I listen to Night Ranger for. You know what I mean? Like, you listen to Metallica for aggression and stuff like that. You don't listen to Night Ranger for it, but I can hear the conflict on the album. Jeff has only got 2 sole songwriting credits on that album, and they're both stuck at the end of the album. I doubt they were ever in the same place at the same time recording it, and that was it. He's been gone ever since, and there's never, ever been any talk of reunion. So whatever it was, it runs deep. And fans will still say, well, I wish the original guys would get back together. Listen, they've had great lineups since, and they've had a solid lineup now for about 10 years, because when they sort of reconvened, because after Alan Fitzgerald left, he was the first to leave. They got a guy named Michael Lardy, who a lot of people know him because he was in Great White, keyboard player and producer in Great White. So he was with them. Then he left, or whatever happened. They had a guy named Christian Cullen, who's never been on an album, but he briefly was the keyboard player. Then he was replaced by a guy named Eric Levy right around 2010. And Eric's been with the band ever since. And Eric has fit right into that Alan Fitzgerald role as far as his choice of keyboard sounds, and has just been a really good fit for the band. Initially, their second guitar player they had was, believe it or not, Reb Beach. And that's something, when I was doing the research for the book, I don't even think I knew that Reb was a Night Ranger. And I'm a fan. I'm a huge Winger fan. I saw Reb when he was in Dokken. I knew that he wasn't all exclusively with
Whitesnake.
Yeah, Whitesnake was the big gig. Yeah, but I don't think I ever knew he was a Night Ranger. So this would have been circa 2007, 2008, just basically long enough for a tour. Then he was replaced by a guy named Joel Hoekstra, who also ended up in Whitesnake. Joel was on 2 albums. Then Joel was replaced by Kerry Kelly. Kerry had been in a lot of bands. I think he was in a version of LA Guns. He's a great fit too. Great players. So you've got 3/5 of the original band intact, the 2 singers, one of the main guitar players, and you've got 2 other guys that are doing their jobs very, very well. You see clips of those guys on stage, they're still bringing it on stage. And as vocalists, Jack and Kelly don't get enough credit for how well their voices have held up. Yes, there's degradation over the years that comes with being 70 years old or almost, but they're still pulling it off and way better than singers that are 10, 15 years younger than them. And they're playing bass and they're playing drums,
Sure, yeah.
It's,
Kelly had some health issues, didn't he?
Kelly had a bit of a heart scare, and I think Dean Castronovo sat in for a gig, which he's a good guy for a job like that because he can sing too.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious. And don't call me Shirley.
Kelly and Jack, their voices similar.
Well,
I thought for the longest time Jack singing Sister Christian.
I have had people say that to me. To me, I've always been able to pick them apart, but I can understand they're not dissimilar. It's not like Triumph with Rick Emmett and Gil Moore. It's really easy to pick those guys apart. When they're singing in a lower key, it is kind of hard to tell who's singing what. Jack and Kelly are both great singers. I think they have very different tones, though. Kelly has a lot of what I would call soul in his singing. I mean, he when he sings it, he means
at
it.
The end of Sister Christian is a perfect example.
Yeah, that's Kelly. Sentimental Street is Kelly. Goodbye is Kelly, even though Jack wrote it. Now, Jack sings Rockin' America and Don't Tell Me You Love Me. Jack's got a naturally higher voice, and it's interesting. I've always found this interesting because when it comes to harmonies, Jack will tend to do the high harmonies, and Kelly will do the lower harmonies. But in Damn Yankees, Tommy Shaw sang higher than Jack, so they switched roles as far as who did the. And in both of those cases, Jack was just this guy that just his voice blended with whoever he was singing with. He's just got that ability, right? But lest anyone think Jack can't sing a ballad, there's plenty of examples where he does. But because Sister Christian was such a huge hit, number one, the record company wanted another ballad as a single. They wanted ballads to come out as the singles, and no rock band wants that. It's the double-edged sword, right? You ask any rock band that had a hit with a ballad, especially their first hit and their biggest hit, it hangs around their necks. And but we're a rock band. It's like, yeah, but you wrote this song and it was a big hit. There are worse problems a band could have. But I do know that it does eat away at a band's credibility. A band that I grew up on and was one of my all-time favorites. I've said this before. It ate Bon Jovi alive. The temptation to go with too many ballads. But because they had such a hit with a ballad and Kelly sang it, MCA's like, give us more ballads and we want Kelly to sing them. So even if Jack wrote Sentimental Street and Goodbye, those are his lyrics. And Goodbye is a very, very personal song for Jack. It was partially inspired by his brother that died young. Kelly ended up singing them. And I don't think that caused any conflict within the band, but like I said, it caused the frustration with the music business. And then there are songs where they trade off lead vocals and are actually the best example. If you want to hear what each of them sounds like, listen to When You Close Your Eyes, because Jack will sing the first part of the verse and then Kelly takes over for the bridge of the song. That's a really good way to distinguish. Okay, that's this guy, that's that guy.
And you were surprised, as I am, that You Can Still Rock in America wasn't a bigger hit.
Yeah, that was actually a song that I also heard back in the day, around the same time that I first heard Sister Christian.
It's my personal favorite Night Ranger song.
It's a great song, but I remember, now this is really going back in time, and I've yet to talk to someone else that remembers this show, but in Canada, we had Much Music. It was Canada's answer to MTV, and it went on the air in 1984. It was not until 1986 that it was on the air where I lived. I knew it existed. And the idea of 24-hour music videos just seemed like, that's amazing. That's the coolest thing ever. So, because I was just sort of obsessed with these little movies put to music, I just, like so many others, it was the generation for it, right? It was the MTV generation. Even if you didn't watch MTV, just the music video craze. And anytime that there was a show that played videos, like at one point, American Bandstand would play one video per show, right? They'd have their standard, the kids dancing format and an
Oh yeah.
interview and somebody like lip syncing on the show, but then they'd play one video. They started doing that. So there'd be like a half-hour video countdown, or there'd be an hour-long countdown, and you'd just comb through the TV guides and try to find them. Well, there was one show that I discovered quite by accident, and I'm not sure how long this show ran, but it was on PBS of all networks, and it was called Color Sounds. And the idea behind this show is that each episode they would show a bunch of videos. They'd show the actual videos, but they'd have the lyrics going, almost like karaoke, or almost like what they call lyric videos now. But they would highlight certain vowel sounds. I'd really love to know what was behind this show and how it ended up on PBS, the home of Sesame Street and stuff.
Right.
I always wonder if there was somebody that worked for PBS that was a younger person that just really wanted to have a music video show, and their excuse or the reason they were able to get it on the air is that they found this educational angle to it. It would teach people about vowel sounds.
Right.
Anyway, I remember catching one particular episode of this. I'm like, what? Why? There's videos on PBS? Like, this is strange. Are they showing the lyrics? Anyway, one of those videos was You Can Still Rock in America. So that stuck with me. I liked that song too. Now, and I mentioned this in my intro, I didn't realize that was the same band. When you're a kid and you don't have the internet was not an option. You just had to find things out any way you could. The information was just not at the drop of a hat. I mean, I remember for years and years in our house, we had encyclopedias if you wanted to look something up, but you're not going to find anything. You're not going to find anything about rock bands.
Yeah.
So
you're not going to find Night Ranger in your encyclopedia.
Yeah, like it was just such a different time. But then when I started listening to Casey Kasem, American Top 40, then I would take in everything he said if there was information about a group, and so I was actively listening to the radio by the time Seven Wishes came out, and I remember hearing Sentimental Street and just being just blown away. That's still one of my favorite Night Ranger songs.
Well, one of the things I discovered by reading the book is that I should give more credit to Jeff Watson, because when I hear a song like You Can Still Rock in America, Brad Gillis, the Whammy Bar, the Floyd Rose he's famous for, but Jeff Watson is the guy you're hearing doing the two-finger tapping.
Yeah, the 2-handed, but 8-finger tapping.
Finger.
He was really, and if you the best example, I think Rockin' America is a good example, but I think Don't Tell Me You Love Me is even better. There's a twin lead solo on that. It's one of my favorite guitar solos of all time. It's a good example of both. Yeah, they were great because they didn't sound like each other at all. They each had their distinct styles, and even though they could shred their faces off, what I loved about, I still love about those guys, I don't know what Jeff's been up to, but they play for the song. It's always about the song, and it's always cool little parts it's what we love about Eddie, right? It's what we love about the Van Halen solos. The techniques that Eddie used were never there just for show. They were to get to the next part of the song and keep you interested. And Night Ranger songs are just packed, even on their ballads. I mean, Brad's solo on Sister Christian is a masterpiece. It's almost a piece of music unto itself.
The choice of notes.
The way that he was able to get a feedback loop going so that he could sustain the notes throughout that entire solo. If you listen to that guitar solo, there's never a point where there's never a note playing. And that's just him, letting the guitar sustain. Great use, very tasty use of the whammy bar. I mean, he can go nuts on the whammy bar too, but...
Is he a disciple of Randy Rhoads? Because I really hear that influence in his play.
I'm not... I mean, he would have been... I'm thinking he and Randy were probably about the same age. I'm sure that he had to study up on Randy's parts, but I'm not sure who Brad's influences were. If I had to make a guess, I would say Jeff Beck was probably a big influence.
Can hear that.
For somebody from a previous generation.
He was only the third guy to get the Floyd Rose, because it was Eddie 1, Neil Sean 2, and then Brad Gillis, who says he traded in his guitar, which his friends thought he was crazy, to sell his guitar so he can get a Floyd Rose.
He's always had that red and black Strat, and I remember when I finally got to see them live a couple of years ago, it's like, there it is, there's that guitar. It's like you get some of these guys, you just know them for certain guitars, like Dave Meniketti playing that Sunburst Les Paul that's all beat up. Yeah, that's his guitar. No one else can play that.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
Bam! The future of rock and roll.
Tell me about the songs. You mentioned Sentimental Street. 4 in the Morning was a number 19 single, and Goodbye is number 17. All these off that third album, Seven Wishes, but you don't hear these songs on the radio. And you don't hear many people talk about them. Why is that?
I don't understand that. Sentimental Street was number 8. It was a top 10 single in the States. And yeah, it doesn't get the recurrent play. I don't understand why that is, other than it's just radio chains pick whatever classic rock songs, they're set in stone, and very rarely do they add to those. And it's just how it is. And again, what it does is just strengthen my resolve. Like something needs to be out there. Look, I know we've got the big wide world of the internet, but if you're trying to look up something, let's be real. It's not easy because there's bits of information here and there's bits of information there. And there's never one place where, Wikipedia is only as good as its contributors, right? Same as Discogs. But there's something about a book that you can pick up, take with you anywhere you go and consult it. I want to know about this album. Okay, well, here's a bunch of people talking about this album. Here's the songs on it. Should give you kind of an idea of what the album is all about. Another thing that Seven Wishes did for Night Ranger is it kind of solidified that they were going to be around. They weren't just, a one-hit wonder and a one-album wonder, like just one successful album. They were able to repeat that success. And I've always wondered if they had... Seven Wishes came out, I think, May or June of 85. And it wasn't until February of 87 until Big Life came out. And if you think about what happened between May of 85 and February of 87, there was a huge shift. It wasn't as big a shift as grunge taking over everything, but it was pretty big. You had Guns N' Roses come out in that time. Bon Jovi hit it big. Whitesnake hit it big. Van Halen went through the singer change. A whole bunch of things changed. The PMRC happened. And I always wondered if Night Ranger had come out with a new album fall of 86, if they'd have been able to keep the momentum up and had another platinum album. I've always wondered about that, I also think that they put all of their eggs in one basket, and that basket was Secret of My Success. That's one of the first times I think that Night Ranger wrote a song that was sort of made to order. They came to them and said, here's the title of the movie, go, write us a theme song. And spoiler alert, I like that song. I also realized that if a younger listener was to listen to it, they would say, man, is this some 80s soundtrack cheese or what?
Yeah.
That's what I like about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly.
It feels good. A lot of their best songs are like anthemic and they feel good to listen to. That's why I like Night Ranger. It's why I like Triumph. It's why I like Survivor. It's why I like Sammy. I like that kind of upbeat stuff. But it's pretty dated in its use of the sequencer. You got that sequencer thing, right. Like it's got that thing running underneath the whole song. They didn't do that before. That's not Alan Fitzgerald going like this. That's him hitting one key, and it just sets the whole thing off, and the band plays to it.
I didn't know it was Night Ranger. This was 1987, for those who may not know, the Michael J. Fox movie of the same name.
Yeah.
When I first heard it, had no idea it was Night Ranger.
Yeah, it was produced by David Foster. It's very slick. It's not that Night Ranger were ever a really raw band, but this was very, very slick. I mean, this was produced to just be a radio hit. They really thought, I'm sure they thought that this movie, The Secret of My Success, was going to be every bit as big as Back to the Future was. Michael J. Fox was one of the biggest stars. I mean, he was one of the biggest TV stars and movie stars. Now, my understanding was this movie did okay, but it wasn't a blockbuster. I never saw it. It wasn't one of those ones that everybody went out and saw. Yeah. And I also know that when they came out with the trailers for the movie, they didn't even play the Night Ranger song. They played Katrina and the Waves, Walking on Sunshine. So they kind of got a raw deal there. The song only peaked at 64 on Billboard, which is, I'm sure that the record label and even the band and probably management were thinking this is going to be top 10 and we don't need to worry about it. We'll have another platinum album for sure. We'll, release Big Life on the back of it. And something just did not click. and they were never the same after that. Now, I mean, Big Life, it did go gold, but I've seen Big Life in cutout bins for years after that, like with holes punched through them. So obviously it was an album that was overproduced. I don't mean overproduced sonically. I mean, they just manufactured too many of them for how many they sold.
Booked on Rock Podcast will be back after this.
I've seen the future. You know what it is? It's a 47-year-old virgin sitting around in his beige pajamas, drinking a banana broccoli shake, thinking I'm an Oscar Mayer wiener.
Find the Booked on Rock website at bookedonrock.com. There you can find all the back episodes of the show, the latest episode in video and audio, links to all of the platforms where you can listen to the podcast, plus all the social media platforms. We're on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and X. Also, check out the Booked on Rock blog, find your local independent bookstore, find out all the latest hot rock book releases, and before you go, check out the Booked on Rock online store. Pick up some Booked on Rock merch. It's all at bookedonrock.com. Sing Me Away, the Night Ranger album review. It's the latest book from our guest, Tim Durling. Let's talk about an album that came and went very quickly, yet you say this is your favorite album from Night Ranger. This is from 1988, Man in Motion. That's the album, right? Their fifth album.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Alan Fitzgerald no longer in the band as the keyboardist. Jack Blades left the band after this to form Damn Yankees. Why did it come and go so quickly, and why is it that you really love this album?
Well, I have a few theories on why it came and went so quickly, but the first thing is that Alan Fitzgerald left, and there are keyboards on Man in Motion. There aren't as many. They're not as prevalent. They're certainly not as prevalent as on Big Life. The album was produced by Keith Olsen. It's a great sounding album sonically, but it's very guitar-centric, and that was the press at the time. Guitars are back. That was their whole press campaign. They were down to a four-piece, and all their publicity photos, the photos inside the album, there were just four of them. Unfortunately, I've said this before, I've said this about a lot of different bands. When you get to 1988, bands that were not full-on hard rock, like Bon Jovi, like Def Leppard, like Whitesnake, bands that I'm sure influenced the likes of Bon Jovi and Def Leppard, and I'll put REO Speedwagon and Survivor, 38 Special, and Toto. I'll put a bunch of those bands. All of them, by the time 88, 89 rolled around, they weren't selling, and they weren't having hits. It wasn't their time anymore. And unfortunately, that's the case for Night Ranger, because you put Night Ranger next to a band like Guns N' Roses, and they seem very polite. You know what I mean? Like, they didn't have a wild image. Now, I don't think a wild image amounts to anything. You have to have good songs, but to the mainstream, people gravitate towards somebody that's always getting attention, and Night Ranger were always more about the music. Also, they were on MCA Records, who were notorious for just burying albums, and the same fate happened to Kansas right around the same time on the same label, because Kansas put out an album called In the Spirit of Things, produced by Bob Ezrin, and it hit the delete bins within months of it coming out.
Why do these record labels bother signing an artist if they're not going to do anything with them?
I think at a certain point, if they think that they're done and say it's the last album on the contract, it's cheaper to put the record out and not promote it than to go back to the band and say, we reject this album, because then they got to pay them more money to go back into a studio for another year and do another album. I mean, Man in Motion came out fairly quickly. It came out a year and a half after Big Life. I can't think of a lot of other examples by the late 80s where a band put out a studio album and then the very next year puts out another studio album. That's pretty quick turnaround. And it didn't stand a chance. And there was one single that charted, and it's one of the few times that you have a song that was written by an outside songwriter. They did a song called I Did It for Love, which was written by Russ Ballard. Now, Russ Ballard is a proven hit songwriter, of course. He wrote New York Groove. He wrote God Gave Rock and Roll to You. He wrote songs for all different kinds of artists. He wrote America's You Can Do Magic. He wrote I Know There's Something Going On by Frida. Great songwriter. You can look up Since You've Been Gone, I Surrender by Rainbow. Night Ranger were proven songwriters too. And my understanding is they submitted the album to MCA and they said, we don't hear a single. You got to have a single on here, even though there's a ballad on Man in Motion called Restless Kind that could have been a huge song.
So that's why they brought in
Ballard?
Okay.
They brought in this Russ Ballard song.
The 80s, that happened a lot.
Yeah.
Heart brought in outside songwriters.
Well,
Kiss.
and if you think about it, I think as many times as it worked, it didn't work. Every situation is different. And in this situation, I think it peaked at number 74. Now, they did a very expensive looking video for it. I don't remember seeing it at the time, but with the advent of YouTube, I remember seeing Morgan Fairchild's in it. Like it looks like money
Really?
was,
Oh my
yeah,
God.
yeah. Apparently she was friends with Jeff Watson. But yeah, it looks like money was spent. The band looks cool in it, but I think that's the only video they did for Man in Motion, and it just didn't get the push. And so the album ended up being deleted. And by 1989, they collectively decided that we're going to knock this on the head, as the British say. I don't think they ever said we're breaking up. Maybe they did, but I don't think it was. Like I said, it wasn't due at that time. It wasn't due to any real animosity. It was like we are sick of we got to. Maybe it was to get out of their deal. I don't know.
Business
Maybe it was.
decision.
It
Maybe.
might have been to get out of the MCA deal, but yeah, I mean, within less than a year, Jack finds himself in another multi-platinum band. It's pretty amazing. And I think the fact that he and Tommy both sang on High Enough, I think that probably felt really good to him. Other than it's a magnificent song. I mean,
It is.
it's an amazing song. Probably one of the best power ballads ever. But he's singing on it, you know, whereas he had years of MCA telling him, no, no, you don't have a voice for ballads. And he's like, you know what? I guess maybe I do.
Do they put that in Night Ranger set lists?
Oh, absolutely. You better believe
yeah.
it. You better believe it. Even if they're just doing a special guest slot, I saw them. I've only seen them once. I saw them a couple of years ago. They came on before Bret Michaels when Bret was doing his Party Gras thing. Almost every set, you can guarantee you're going to hear High Enough, Coming of Age. You might even hear Come Again. Now, I didn't.
That's
they didn't
a great
do that
song.
one. Yeah. They didn't do that when I saw them, but they did Coming of Age and High Enough. And I'm looking. It's funny because you and I, we know so much about this stuff. I'm looking around the crowd and everybody's singing along, but I bet you there's a lot of people there going, I didn't know Night Ranger sang this.
Right.
Not putting two and two together,
Right.
like, well, they didn't, but he did,
Yeah.
And then they usually also do Crazy Train to honor Brad's time with Ozzy. Now, that's a lot of fans will say, I wish they'd do more Night Ranger songs. You can't make everybody happy. You got to play songs people know, right? And
Yeah.
that was a double platinum album, that first Damn Yankees album, so people know those songs.
Speaking of songs everybody knows, this is interesting. Let's go back to Feeding Off the Mojo from 95. There were 3 albums. I think you mentioned all 3 from the 90s. There's 95's Feeding Off the Mojo, 97's Neverland, and 98's Seven. But off Feeding Off the Mojo, that's the one where they covered Frampton's Do You Feel Like We Do, right? Combined with the Beatles' Tomorrow Never Knows?
Yeah. See, Feeding Off the Mojo came out on this label called Drive Entertainment, which is, I've never heard of it since. That's the only album I've ever seen on this label. Now, there's a guy that's credited on that album named Don Grierson, which is a name I recognize because he was an A&R guy for Capitol. And if my understanding is that he had a lot to do with getting Hart signed to Capitol in the mid-'80s and, of course, setting them for that huge comeback. And this might have been he might have been trying to form a label and it never got a major label distributor. I happened to read about it in Metal Edge. Otherwise I never would have known that it existed. And I have to think that was a label thing saying, we need something for radio to play. And, at a certain point, almost every band did covers albums.
Yes, in the 90s, because they thought classic rock radio wasn't going to play the new single.
Your best shot was to play, okay, well, if they know the song and they know the band, maybe you'll get some play.
We'll play a new single if it's old material or old music that we already know.
I think that's what happened because I do know that there were other songs that those guys were working on that didn't end up on the album. Now, I think a couple of them ended up on one of Brad's solo albums. I think one of them ended up on one of Kelly's solo albums. I'm not familiar with that stuff. I probably should be. But I do know that there were other songs that they were working on. Some would say they were better songs. I have to think the reason that they did this was to have something, a talking point for, classic rock radio. Classic rock radio was a relatively new thing, too, by the mid-'90s, if I recall correctly. So I think it's well done, but I would just rather hear another original song. It's a good sounding album, too. It was produced by David Prater. He produced Firehouse. He produced Dream Theater's Images and Words. He had, semi-reputation. And for an independent album, it doesn't sound like it was done on a shoestring budget either. It's a good sounding album. I think a lot of people would be surprised, even if they can listen to it and go, well, it didn't really sound like Night Ranger, but I like it.
Was the label's packaging of the 7 album low budget? You do not like...
Okay, so
Let's get to this.
so what happened there?
You're not a fan of this.
The Feeding Off the Mojo album kind of came and went. All right, then the band got an offer. They got an offer from, I think, a Japanese label to reunite, because that's Night Ranger and bands like that. They always did well in Japan. You know, you could always think about if you were trying to fill out a collection of a band on CD before the advent of things like Rock Candy Records, you pretty much had to get Japanese imports. That's how I got most of those Y&T albums that came out in the 80s. If it wasn't for the Japanese imports, I wouldn't have them on CD. So, you know, it stands to reason a band like Night Ranger would have quite a following over there. So they reunited, and they actually signed with Sony. John David Kolodner, the famous A&R guy who left Geffen for Sony, you know, he revived Aerosmith and Whitesnake. He's a pretty well-known probably one of the most well-known A&R guys in our field of music that we tend to talk about. He and Jack, I think he had something to do with forming Damn Yankees. I don't know. Kolodner did a lot of trying to find guys that weren't in bands at the time but had been and put them together. I mean, I think he had a lot to do with the Coverdale Page album. Well, what about this? Or, you know, put these two guys together and see what happens. But anyway, he got them signed to Sony, and they put the Neverland album out. Ron Nevison produced it, and I think there's a couple songs in there that could have caught on to radio. But again, bands like Night Ranger the scene was hostile towards veteran bands. And just about every band took a big sales drop. I mean, even a band like Def Leppard with 2 diamond-selling albums couldn't get past gold for the Slang album. So it was not favorable for bands from the 80s. It was like you didn't dare admit that you were from the 80s.
Remember Def Leppard went back to their signature sound on
Euphoria. Yeah.
To just get their longtime fans back.
Made me happy. I know that. I heard Promises on the radio. I'm like, this is more like it.
Yeah, it's a good album.
But anyway, Neverland didn't sell. It wasn't promoted very well. And again, it's like, I don't know why Sony bothered. They didn't even do a video for the lead single, which is just, it boggles my mind. So by the time 7 came around, they were down to CMC International. And I'm sure you recognize that name because that was a label that started up in the early 90s.
Slaughter was on there.
Warrant was on there. Yngwie was on there. Dee Snider's band Widowmaker was on there. Accept, I think, was on CMC. Lynyrd Skynyrd, they actually had a gold record. I think they're the only gold record on that label. But obviously, they just didn't have deep enough pockets. So the 7th album cover is just the guy sitting on a porch. And that's it. But what I really don't like is if you get the CD to 7, the US CD, because of the background that they print over it, it's almost impossible to read the credits. Like, I think it was a really big oversight, and someone should have fixed that. It's just about impossible to read the lyrics and credits.
It just tells you where things had gotten for all of those bands.
It was hard times, even though, oddly enough, I like the Neverland album quite a bit, and I was quite excited when it came out. I think I like 7 better. It's a better album, over song for song. So, you know, they were putting out good music. It's just that it was just so hard to get in a foothold. And like I said, they had to find their way somehow. And they put that Hole in the Sun record out, which I don't know how to, I would have to say, just listen to it and to see what you think.
2007 that came out.
2007, but it sounds more like an album that a band like that would have tried to do in the mid-90s. It sounds more like Dokken doing Shadow Life, although it's not that bad. But it sounds like a band trying to adapt somehow to changing musical trends instead of doing what they're best at. And like I said, since Somewhere in California in 2011, I think they finally realized this is what we do. This is what we're good at. And this is what people respond to. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to stick to our guns. Not that they've been putting out clones of their older albums, but I think it was a stage they had to go through. Yeah, it was an interesting period for sure. I mean, I thought after the Hole in the Sun album, I thought, well, that's probably going to be it for Night Ranger. We're not going to have any more new music from them. Glad I was wrong.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
I mean, there's like no way that we can just pause for a minute. You guys just go home and do your stuff, and then tomorrow we can just like continue.
Hey guys, thanks so much for checking out the Booked on Rock Podcast. If you've just found the podcast, welcome. If you've been listening, thank you so much for your support. And make sure you tell a friend, a family member, share on social media, and let people know about Booked on Rock. And if you do like the podcast, make sure you subscribe, give a 5-star review wherever you listen to the Booked on Rock podcast. We're on Amazon, Apple, iHeart, Spotify, Spreaker, TuneIn, and on YouTube Music. You can check out the full episodes on video, along with video highlights from episodes, on the Booked on Rock YouTube channel. Find it at Booked on Rock. Thanks again for listening. Now back to the show. Another album after Somewhere in California 3 years later with High Road, and then Don't Let Up 2017, ATBPO 2021, which, by the way, stands for And the Band Played On, which is cool because of COVID shutting down.
That was very much a COVID-inspired thing. That's why the cover has a road case on it.
A nod to the road crew.
Nod to the road crew, yeah. And they've got a lot of guys in the road crew that have been with them for many, many years, too. It's pretty much a family. But yeah, there's so many great albums. And anything I see, there's even moments on Hole in the Sun that I think, that's not bad. That's not bad. It's just, you can't always knock it out of the park. It's pretty hard, especially if, I can't imagine what it would have been like to be trying to make new music in an era that was just not receptive to your kind of music. It must have been a very, very strange thing. And yet they had songs that they could go on the road and play to decent size audiences. So it's like, I don't get it. I don't know where the disconnect is.
If you want to just go by the hits from the 80s, that alone is reason to go see these guys. But like you say, there's a lot more to this band. And now we're in an era where you can go to YouTube and Spotify and listen to this stuff and really enjoy it, and not listen to it in the context of when it came out at that time. Listen to it just as a standalone rock and roll album or a standalone Night Ranger album.
Yeah. And for the most part, I think that their productions have stood up quite well to the test of time. They don't really have a lot of albums that sound dated to my ears. I mean, maybe the 80s albums would sound dated to a younger listener, but certainly the newer ones they've done are very, very well produced, and they kind of do it themselves. I mean, Jack ended up being an accomplished producer in his own right. He built his own studio on his property, and it's kind of all contained, and they come out with good sounding albums. And like I said, they still perform at a really, really high level, and I would just love for more people to just know about more than just Sister Christian for start. I mean, really, if somebody was just mildly curious, please buy the book. But if you're going to buy one thing, that original Greatest Hits that came out in 1989, that's great. I mean, that's a great collection of songs. If you find yourself liking that, there's really, aside from, like I said, a few left turns, there really isn't anything that sounds so different that you wouldn't even know it's the same band. Like Somewhere in California, I have described as one of those very rare examples of a band putting out, I'm going to call it a latter day album, even though it's 14 years, but an album in this century from an 80s band that is so good that I would almost say you could start with that, and that'll tell you what Night Ranger sounds like. You won't know any of the songs, but you'll probably end up getting them in your head after you hear them.
And they're on tour this summer, so if you live in Tennessee or Minnesota or Wisconsin or Michigan, Illinois, they are coming around. Also, New York, it looks like here, North Tonawanda, New York in August, Ohio, California. So check them out, nightranger.com, and get the book written by our friend Tim Durling. A much more in-depth review of all 13 albums in Sing Me Away, the Night Ranger album review, and it also includes a foreword from Phil Aston of Now Spinning Magazine, and a discussion of Night Ranger guitarist with Canadian musician and author Sean Kelly, who was on this show to talk about his excellent book,
Don't Call It Hair Metal.
Don't Call It Hair Metal.
Yeah.
Great guy, great guest. So that's in the book. Great photos of the band. So it's out now. You could get it at Amazon. That's the place to go. You can not only get that book there, but go to Amazon to get Tim's book on Sammy Hagar, Y&T, Unspooled, Kansas, they're all there.
I've got 5 now. 4 years ago, I didn't have any. Now I got 5.
I think we can call you prolific. Can we go there?
Well, I'll tell you what. I'll tell you you can, and I'll take that gladly. But I got to shout out my buddy Matt Phillips from Go North Design, because he puts it all together for me, and he does a great job. So
talk about where people can find you on YouTube, whatever you want to plug besides the book. Go for it.
I've still got my, YouTube channel, Tim's Vinyl Confessions. I put out 3 new episodes every week, and you can find me on YouTube. Actually, if you type in timsvinylconfessions.com, it'll take you right to my YouTube page. I rent the URL so someone else does. I don't know why anybody else would want to use it, but that's in case I ever want to do a website. I've got the URL. Anyway, that'll open up my YouTube page, but I'm on all the socials, and I post daily stuff from my collection, and you could see me on the Contrarians. I'm on the Contrarians a lot, and I'm just very grateful to, have the chance to promote the stuff on your channel and a lot of other great channels that have said, yeah, well, we'll have them on and talk to them. And it's gratifying. I've all of the books that I've done on specific bands or artists, I've had people come back to me and say, yeah, I only had a couple albums. Now I ordered a few more and it's really good. So that's what I want to see happen with the Night Ranger, just have people go, where has this stuff been? Why haven't I been listening to this for years now? Why isn't this, this is so good. And if you like this kind of melodic rock, and man, it doesn't get much better.
Great band. San Francisco's Night Ranger. All right, Tim, thanks so much, man.
Thanks, Eric.
That's it. It's in the books.